Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world where medicine is a prayer and a plague is a message. Imagine the air, thick and humid, not with the familiar scent of rain, but with the coppery tang of blood. The great river that gives you life, your water, your food, your highway, is suddenly, inexplicably, a stagnant artery of death. The fish are floating belly up, a silver blanket on a crimson tide. This isn't a horror movie. For the ancient Egyptians, this was the terrifying start of a conversation they did not want to have. And let's be honest, without modern sanitation, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of germ theory, your chances of making it through what comes next would be slim. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the comments, I'd love to see where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a quiet joy to see this little community stretching across the globe. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the land of Egypt, a kingdom built on two things: the power of its pharaoh and the lifeblood of its river, the Nile. For centuries, Egypt had been the unchallenged superpower of the ancient world. Its pyramids scraped the heavens, its armies were formidable, and its gods seemed to smile upon it. The Nile, with its predictable, life-giving flood, was the engine of this prosperity. It deposited rich, black silt upon the fields, ensuring bountiful harvests year after year. The river was more than water. It was a deity, a promise, a rhythm to which all of life danced. The Egyptians saw this consistency as proof of Mad, the cosmic order, balance, and truth that governed the universe. Their gods were powerful. Their pharaoh was the god's representative on earth, and their world was, for the most part, stable and secure. But beneath this gleaming surface of power and order, a deep injustice festered. A nation within a nation, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Israelites, were living in bondage. They were the engine behind the engine, the slave labor that built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramesses. Their backs bent under the Egyptian sun, their hands raw from mixing mud and straw, their cries unheard by the man who sat on the throne. The book of Exodus tells us that a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. The era of goodwill was over, replaced by fear. Pharaoh saw the Israelites' growing numbers not as a blessing, but as a threat. What if they joined with Egypt's enemies? So he oppressed them, hoping to break their spirit and curb their population. When that didn't work, he issued a chilling decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the very river that gave Egypt its life. The Nile, the symbol of life, was twisted into an instrument of death. It's into this world of stark contrasts, of divine order and brutal oppression, of life-giving water and state-sanctioned murder that two figures emerge. Two brothers, Moses and Aaron. Moses, a Hebrew by birth, but raised in the splendor of Pharaoh's own court, after being famously rescued from that same river. He had fled Egypt after killing an abusive taskmaster spent 40 years as a shepherd in the quiet wilderness of Midian, a man humbled and stripped of his princely identity. It was there, in the silence of the desert, that he encountered the God of his ancestors in the form of a burning bush, a fire that burned but did not consume. He was given a seemingly impossible task. Go back to the most powerful man on earth and say, "Let my people go." He wasn't sent alone. His brother Aaron, more eloquent and steady, was to be his spokesman. So these two men, one a fugitive shepherd in his 80s and the other a slave, walk into the grand throne room of the Pharaoh. You have to imagine the scene. The soaring columns painted with scenes of Egyptian victories, the smell of incense, the courtiers in their fine linen and elaborate wigs, and on his throne, the Pharaoh, considered not just a king, but a living god, the incarnation of Horus. And before him stand two old men from a slave race, armed with nothing but a shepherd's staff and a message from a god Pharaoh doesn't recognize. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" Pharaoh scoffs. "I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." To demonstrate the power behind their words, Aaron throws down his staff, and it becomes a serpent. A startling trick, perhaps, but Pharaoh is unimpressed. He calls his own sorcerers and magicians, the wise men of Egypt, who, through their secret arts, replicate the feat. Their own staffs become serpents. For a moment, it's a stalemate, a contest of magic. But then, the narrative gives us a crucial detail. Aaron's serpent staff swallows theirs. It's a small, symbolic victory, a foreshadowing of what's to come. The power these men represent is not just equal to Egypt's, it is superior. It can and will consume it. But Pharaoh's heart, we are told, was hardened. He dismisses them. The first confrontation is over. The stage is now set not for a negotiation, but for a lesson. A series of 10 lessons, in fact, that would escalate in severity until the very foundation of Egyptian life and belief was shattered. This divine curriculum would come to be known as the 10 plagues. The first of these divine lessons was aimed directly at the heart of Egypt, the Nile itself. The next morning, Moses and Aaron were instructed to meet Pharaoh by the riverbank. It was likely a place of ritual, where Pharaoh would perform rites to honor the gods of the river, perhaps Hapi, the god of the annual inundation, or Khnum, the guardian of the Nile's source. Standing there on the sacred ground, the command was given. Aaron lifted his staff and struck the water in full view of Pharaoh and his servants. The result was instantaneous and horrifying. The water, the clear, life-sustaining water of the great river, turned to blood. Exodus describes it vividly. All the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. This wasn't just a discoloration. It was a fundamental corruption of the source of life. The stench of decay would have filled the air for miles. The economic impact would have been immediate. Fishing, a staple of the Egyptian diet and economy, was wiped out. The river, their primary mode of transportation, was now a foul, unusable canal of death. theological shockwave would have been even greater. Happy, the god who was supposed to ensure the river's purity and bounty, was shown to be powerless. The sacred river, an object of worship, had become an object of horror. The very symbol of mad, of cosmic order, was now a portrait of chaos. Of course, for centuries, people have sought to find a natural explanation for this event. It's not an unreasonable impulse. The Bible often describes God working through natural phenomena. The leading theory is what's sometimes called a red tide, a harmful algal bloom. Specifically, a bloom of a dinoflagellate like Pfiesteria piscicida, or a bacterium like Burgundibacillus. Under the right conditions, perhaps unusually sluggish water flow and high nutrient content from runoff, these microorganisms can multiply explosively, releasing toxins that kill fish and turn the water a deep, blood-red color. The decomposition of millions of dead fish would consume the oxygen in the water, making it anaerobic and foul-smelling, precisely as the Bible describes. This is a plausible scientific mechanism, but it doesn't diminish the event's significance in the narrative. For the Israelites, the timing was the miracle. The fact that it happened precisely when Aaron struck the water, at the command of God, transformed a potential natural disaster into a deliberate, targeted act of divine power. Pharaoh's reaction is telling. He calls his magicians once more, and using their secret arts, they too produce something that looks like blood, likely on a small scale with water they had dug for. Exodus says the Egyptians dug all along the Nile to find groundwater to drink, which supports the idea that the main channel was contaminated, but the aquifer was not, because his own experts could replicate the effect, however superficially. Pharaoh was able to dismiss the larger catastrophe unfolding before him. He saw a trick, not a judgment. His heart remained hard, and he turned and went into his house, refusing to take even this to heart. For 7 days, the whole of Egypt suffered. For 7 days, their river of life was a river of death. The first blow had been struck, demonstrating that the God of the Hebrews had power over the very essence of Egyptian existence. After a week of stench and death, the second plague emerged directly from the corrupted waters. God instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go. But if you refuse, I will plague all your country with frogs." And as Aaron stretched his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came. Not just a few. The text says the Nile swarmed with frogs, and they came up from the river and went everywhere. Into the palace, into the bedrooms, onto the beds, into the ovens and kneading bowls. There was no escape. Imagine the sensory nightmare. The constant, deafening croaking day and night. The slimy feel of them underfoot, in your food, in your bedsheets. The smell of them. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a complete invasion of personal and sacred space. The frog was a symbol of fertility and life in Egypt, associated with the goddess Hecate, a frog-headed deity who was believed to assist in childbirth. This plague took that positive symbol and turned it into a repulsive, suffocating curse. The very symbol of life became a torment. Hecate, the goddess of birth, was grotesquely mimicked by a plague that birthed an inescapable army of amphibians. She was utterly powerless to stop it. The naturalistic explanation for this follows logically from the first plague. With the Nile contaminated and the predatory fish dead, the natural check on the frog population was gone. The toxic water would have driven the amphibians onto the land in a desperate search for a habitable environment. What would normally be a large but manageable frog population could have exploded and migrated en masse, creating the exact scenario described. The ecological balance, so central to Egyptian stability, had been broken. And this was the immediate, slimy consequence. This time, the plague was too personal for Pharaoh to ignore. His magicians could also bring up frogs, likely through trickery, but they were completely unable to make them go away. Their power was limited to imitation, not restoration. This is a critical point. The powers of Egypt could add to the problem, but they couldn't solve it. Overwhelmed, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. For the first time, he cracked. "Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people," he says, "and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." He acknowledges, for a moment, the power of Moses' God. Moses asks Pharaoh to set the time for the frog's removal. A clever move to prove this is no coincidence. Pharaoh, perhaps wanting it over as soon as possible, says, "Tomorrow." The next day, as promised, the frogs died. They died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the fields. The relief was immediately followed by another nauseating problem: what to do with the bodies. The Egyptians gathered them into heaps, and the text notes, "The land stank." The smell of rotting fish in the river was replaced by the smell of rotting frogs on the land. But as soon as the pressure was off, as soon as he could breathe again, Pharaoh's resolve returned. When Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them. The promise was broken. The respite was seen not as an act of mercy to be reciprocated, but as a sign of weakness to be exploited. The third plague followed swiftly, and it marked a significant turning point. Aaron was commanded to strike the dust of the earth with his staff, and when he did, the dust throughout all the land of Egypt became gnats. The Hebrew word used here is kinnim, which has been variously translated as gnats, lice, or sandflies. Whatever the specific insect, the effect was the same. A cloud of tiny, biting, irritating pests that swarmed over man and beast. Unlike the frogs, these were impossible to escape. They were in your eyes, your nose, your clothes. The misery would have been constant, a maddening, inescapable irritation. From a natural perspective, this also follows the chain of events. The death of the frogs would have removed a major predator of insects. The heaps of rotting frog carcasses would have provided a perfect breeding ground. With the ecological balance so thoroughly disrupted, a population explosion of insects like sandflies or midges is entirely plausible. This plague targeted Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth. The very dust of the land, which was his domain, rose up to attack its inhabitants. The sacred earth of Egypt had become a source of torment. the most important part of this plague is the reaction of Pharaoh's magicians. They tried to produce gnats with their secret arts, just as they had with the blood and the frogs. And this time they failed. Their powers had reached their limit. They went to Pharaoh and delivered a chilling verdict. This is the finger of God. It's a remarkable admission. They recognized a power at work that was beyond human manipulation or trickery. It was supernatural, divine, and it was not on their side. They were essentially telling their king, "We can't fight this. You are up against something real." Yet, even with his own experts telling him he was outmatched, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The testimony of his trusted advisors was not enough to sway him. His pride was too great. With the fourth plague, a new and crucial distinction was introduced. The plague was one of flies, or more accurately, a swarm of destructive insects. The Hebrew word is arav, which implies a mixture of various pests. These weren't just annoying houseflies. They were likely biting flies like the stable fly, Stomoxys calcitrans, which could torment both humans and animals and act as vectors for disease. The houses of the Egyptians were filled with them, and the land was ruined by them. Again, this fits the ecological cascade. With the land full of carcasses and filth from the previous plagues, the conditions were perfect for a massive insect infestation. This plague may have been an assault on Khepri, the god of creation and rebirth, often depicted as a scarab beetle. The teeming, swarming insect life was a perverse mockery of his creative power, but the text adds a critical detail. But on that day, I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there. For the first time, God explicitly draws a geographical and ethnic line of protection. The Israelites were to be spectators, not victims. This was no longer just a series of unfortunate natural disasters affecting everyone. It was a targeted, surgical strike. The message was unmistakable. The God of the Hebrews was not just attacking Egypt. He was simultaneously protecting his own people. This act served a dual purpose. It intensified the psychological pressure on the Egyptians, who could now see a clear boundary between suffering and safety, and it bolstered the faith of the Israelites, providing a tangible sign that they were indeed under divine protection. This distinction would continue through most of the remaining plagues, making it impossible for Pharaoh to dismiss them as mere coincidence. Even so, the pattern repeats. Pharaoh bargains, promising to let the people go if the plague is removed. Moses agrees. The flies disappear, and once the relief comes, Pharaoh hardens his heart and reneges on his word. His promises were as transient as the plagues themselves. The fifth plague escalated from causing discomfort to causing economic devastation. It struck where Egyptian wealth was most visible, their livestock. The text speaks of a very severe pestilence that struck the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks of the Egyptians. But once again, the distinction was made clear. Not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. This would have been a catastrophic blow. Livestock were essential for agriculture, plowing fields, transportation, military power, horses and chariots, and food. A massive die-off would cripple the Egyptian economy and food supply. The theological targets were numerous. Hathor, the mother goddess often depicted as a cow, Apis, the sacred bull worshipped as an incarnation of the god Ptah, and many others. These divine animals, which were supposed to be under the protection of the gods, died indiscriminately. The gods of Egypt were shown to be incapable of protecting even their own sacred embodiments. Scientifically, the plague of flies provides a direct vector for this pestilence. Biting insects like the stable fly can transmit bacterial diseases like anthrax or viral diseases like rinderpest. An outbreak of such a disease, spreading rapidly through the already stressed animal populations, could easily create the mass death described in Exodus. The fact that the Israelite livestock in Goshen were spared could be attributed to their geographical separation. But in the narrative's logic, it was another deliberate act of divine protection, highlighting the precise control being exerted over events. Pharaoh sent messengers to verify that the Israelite animals were unharmed. The report came back confirming it. The evidence of a targeted miracle was undeniable, and yet the text says, "The heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go." He was now seeing direct proof, investigating it himself, and still choosing defiance. The plagues were now becoming intensely personal, moving from the environment and economy to the bodies of the Egyptians themselves. For the sixth plague, Moses was instructed to take handfuls of soot from a kiln and throw it into the air in front of Pharaoh. The fine dust settled on the people and animals throughout Egypt and became festering boils. This was a particularly insidious affliction, painful, disfiguring, and debilitating. It would have caused widespread suffering and panic. Crucially, the text notes that the boils afflicted the magicians and all the Egyptians. Pharaoh's own spiritual and magical experts were not immune. In fact, they could not stand before Moses because of the boils. Their bodies were now a testament to their own powerlessness. They couldn't even show up to work. This plague was a direct challenge to the Egyptian deities of healing and protection, such as Sekhmet, the fierce lion-headed goddess of plagues and medicine, or Isis, the great mother goddess known for her healing spells. Their power was shown to be utterly useless against this onslaught. The symbolism of the soot from a kiln is potent. The kilns were where the Israelite slaves toiled, making bricks. The very dust of their servitude was now being thrown back into the faces of their oppressors, becoming a source of sickness and pain. It was a poetic and terrible justice. The medical explanation is speculative, but could be linked to the previous plagues. Diseases like skin anthrax can be transmitted by flies and result in black, boil-like lesions. Another possibility is glanders, a bacterial infection primarily affecting horses, which were already dying, but which can be transmitted to humans, causing skin abscesses. Whatever the specific pathogen, it was a miserable and humiliating affliction. By now, the pattern of Pharaoh's defiance was deeply entrenched. Even as his people suffered from painful sores, even as his own advisors were incapacitated, his heart remained stubborn. The seventh plague brought a terrifying display of raw power from the heavens. Moses warned Pharaoh of what was coming. The next day, God would send the heaviest hail that had ever fallen on Egypt. For the first time, a clear warning was given not just to Pharaoh, but to all the Egyptians. The message was, in essence, take this seriously. Bring your livestock and servants under shelter, or they will die. The text tells us that some of Pharaoh's servants feared the word of the Lord and brought their people and animals inside. Others ignored the warning. It shows a crack in the national resolve. Some Egyptians were beginning to believe. Then the storm hit, and it wasn't just hail. Exodus describes it as hail mixed with fire, flashing continually. A terrifying, supernatural tempest. In a climate like Egypt's, where significant hail is exceedingly rare, this would have been an event of apocalyptic proportions. It shattered everything in the open: people, animals, trees, and crops. The flax and barley, which were already in bloom, were destroyed. The wheat and emmer, which ripened later, were spared. This small detail adds a layer of agricultural realism to the account. The storm was a direct assault on the gods of the sky, like Nut, the sky goddess, and Shu, the god of the air. They were powerless to stop the celestial onslaught. A modern meteorological explanation could point to a particularly violent supercell thunderstorm, which can produce massive hailstones and dramatic lightning that might be described as fire. But again, for the people on the ground, the source was less important than the timing and the unprecedented violence of the event. After the storm had wrought its destruction, a terrified Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time, his confession was more complete. "This time I have sinned," he said. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with the Lord, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go." It sounds like a genuine breakthrough. He admits his sin and acknowledges God's righteousness. Moses agrees to pray for the storm to end, but also expresses his skepticism, telling Pharaoh, "I know that you do not yet fear the Lord God." Moses could see that this was a confession born of terror, not true repentance. And he was right. As soon as the thunder, hail, and rain ceased, Pharaoh, seeing that the worst was over, hardened his heart once more, he and his servants. The brief moment of clarity was gone, swallowed by pride. What the hail had not destroyed, the eighth plague would consume. God told Moses, "I will bring locusts into your country." The devastation of an ancient locust swarm is hard for us to comprehend. These were not just a few grasshoppers. This was a living, moving, eating cloud that could stretch for hundreds of square miles, containing billions of insects. They would block out the sun, and the sound of their wings and mandibles would be a deafening roar. Moses and Aaron delivered the warning. If Pharaoh refused, the locusts would cover the face of the land so that the ground could not be seen. They would eat every last green thing that the hail had left behind. this point, even Pharaoh's own officials had had enough. They pleaded with their king, "How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go. Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" The country was collapsing. The economy was shattered. The infrastructure was failing. The people were suffering. And they knew why. But Pharaoh, in his monumental stubbornness, tried to negotiate. He offered to let only the men go, keeping the women and children as leverage. Moses refused. The entire community must go. Enraged, Pharaoh drove them from his presence. Then an east wind began to blow. It blew all that day and all that night, and in the morning the wind brought the locusts. The description in Exodus is chilling. They covered the face of the whole land, so that the land was darkened, and they ate all the plants in the land, and all the fruit of the trees that the hail had left. Not a green thing remained, neither tree nor plant of the field, through all the land of Egypt. This was total agricultural annihilation. The food supply was gone. This plague was an attack on the gods of the harvest and protection, like Seth, who was thought to guard the crops, or Osiris, the god of agriculture and life. The land he was supposed to bless was now barren. Desperate, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron again. "I have sinned against the Lord your God, and against you," he cried, asking for forgiveness, and for them to plead with God to take away this death. The locusts were seen as a harbinger of mass starvation. Moses prayed, and the Lord sent a strong west wind, which picked up the locusts and cast them into the Red Sea. Not a single one remained. And then, the inevitable. Once the immediate threat was gone, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the people of Israel go. The 9th plague was perhaps the most psychologically terrifying. It wasn't loud or destructive in a physical sense. It was a plague of profound and utter darkness. Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. This wasn't just the absence of light. The text describes a darkness that could be felt. It was a heavy, oppressive, primal blackness that smothered everything. In a society that revered the sun, this was the ultimate theological blow. Their chief deity, Ra, the sun god, the king of the gods from whom Pharaoh himself was said to descend, was blotted out. For 3 days, his power was non-existent. The cosmic order, mad, was completely inverted. Chaos reigned. The Egyptians were left paralyzed in their homes, isolated in a terrifying, tangible void. Yet, in the midst of this profound darkness, there was a stark contrast. All the people of Israel had light in their dwellings. Again, the distinction was sharp and absolute. While the Egyptians were trapped in a terrifying, supernatural gloom, the Israelites in Goshen lived in light. The God of the Hebrews demonstrated that he had control over the very source of light and life, a power that eclipsed Egypt's most powerful god. What could cause such a thing? The most common natural explanation is a severe calm scene, a desert sandstorm that can be so thick with sand and dust that it completely blots out the sun for days, creating a reddish, oppressive gloom. Another theory points to the fallout from a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps the Thera eruption on the island of Santorini. The vast cloud of ash could have drifted over Egypt, creating a prolonged, sun-blocking darkness. But as with the other plagues, the narrative frames it as a precise, controlled event. It starts when Moses raises his hand, and it affects only the Egyptians. This time, Pharaoh's negotiation was different. He summoned Moses out of the darkness and said, "Go, serve the Lord. Your little ones also may go with you. Only let your flocks and your herds remain behind." He had finally agreed to let all the people go, but he wanted to keep their livestock, their wealth, their livelihood. It was his last attempt to maintain some form of control, to hold them as economic hostages. Moses refused. Their livestock were needed for the sacrifices. "Not a hoof shall be left behind," he declared. This final refusal pushed Pharaoh over the edge. "Get away from me," he roared. "Take care never to see my face again, for on the day you see my face you shall die." Moses' calm reply was chilling in its finality. "As you say, I will not see your face again." The negotiations were over. The warnings were finished. The final, most devastating plague was about to fall. The 10th and final plague was the one that would finally break the will of Pharaoh and the spirit of Egypt. It was announced with solemn gravity. At about midnight, God would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn in the land would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl at the handmill, and even the firstborn of the livestock. A great cry of anguish would rise up from Egypt, a cry like none before or since. This was not a disease or a natural disaster. It was presented as a direct, divine, and precisely targeted act of judgment. It was a measure-for-measure response to Pharaoh's decree years earlier to kill the firstborn sons of the Hebrews. The nation that had tried to destroy God's firstborn son, Israel, would now lose its own. The theological weight was immense. The firstborn son was the heir, the future of the family line, the one who carried the name and the inheritance. To lose the firstborn was to have your future cut off. For Pharaoh, whose own firstborn son was considered a god in waiting, this was the ultimate defeat. It was a direct, fatal blow to the dynasty and to the very idea of Pharaoh's divinity. But for this final plague, the Israelites were given not just protection, but a ritual to perform, a covenant to enact. This was the institution of the Passover. Each family was to take a year-old male lamb without blemish. They were to slaughter it at twilight and paint some of its blood on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their houses. They were to roast the lamb and eat it in haste, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, their loins girded, their sandals on their feet, and their staff in their hand, ready to leave at a moment's notice. The blood on the doorframe would be a sign. "When I see the blood," God said, "I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." That night, as the Israelites huddled in their homes, sharing this strange, sacred meal, death passed through the land of Egypt. At midnight, the Lord struck down every firstborn. The text says, "There was not a house where someone was not dead." The great cry that Moses had foretold erupted across the nation, a singular wave of grief and terror from the palace to the dungeon. Pharaoh himself was struck. His heir, the future of his divine line, was dead. The breaking point had been reached. Pride, power, and stubbornness, all shattered in a single night of unimaginable loss. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His words were no longer defiant or bargaining. They were a desperate plea. "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone. And bless me also." That last phrase is stunning. The God King of Egypt, the man who had said, "Who is the Lord?" was now begging for a blessing from the representatives of that same Lord. The Egyptians, in their grief and terror, urged the Israelites to leave quickly. "We shall all be dead," they cried. They loaded the Hebrews with silver, gold, and clothing, not as payment, but as a desperate appeasement, hoping to hasten their departure and end the horror. And so, after 430 years of sojourning and servitude, the people of Israel marched out of Egypt, a newly liberated nation, born from a crucible of suffering and miraculous deliverance. The 10 plagues, taken as a whole, are a masterfully constructed narrative. They build in a relentless crescendo, from environmental disruption to economic ruin, from physical suffering to psychological terror, culminating in a devastating national tragedy. Whether one reads them as a series of divinely timed natural events in an ecological cascade, or as purely supernatural acts, their purpose in the story is clear. They were a systematic dismantling of the Egyptian pantheon, showing the God of a slave people to be more powerful than the gods of the mightiest empire on earth. They were a judgment on the brutal oppression of a nation. And most importantly, they were the means of liberation, the terrible and awe-inspiring signs and wonders that forged the identity of Israel and set them on the path to the promised land. They began with a conversation Pharaoh refused to have, and they ended with a cry that echoed through eternity. Our story picks up in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of liberation. The Israelites have just walked away from Egypt, their backs turned on centuries of slavery. They have witnessed the systematic takedown of a superpower by the hand of their God, culminating in that terrible final night of the Passover. They have walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, a corridor of water piled high on either side, and watched as that same water crashed down upon the mightiest army in the world, swallowing Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen whole. They are, for the first time in their collective memory, a free people. And as Miriam, the sister of Moses, leads the women in a dance of victory on the far shore of the sea, the air is filled with a sense of euphoria, of impossible triumph. They are free, but freedom, as they are about to learn, is a far more complicated and demanding thing than servitude. The wilderness that now stretches before them is a stark and terrifying contrast to the land they have left. Egypt, for all its cruelty, was predictable. The Nile provided water. The fields, watered by that Nile, provided food. Life was structured, ordered, and in a grim way, secure. You knew what to expect each day. The desert, however, is the very opposite of this. It is a vast, empty, and unforgiving landscape. It is a world of shimmering heat, of shifting sands, of rock and scrub and silence. There are no storehouses of grain here, no reliable rivers, no cities, no shelter. Survival is a daily, desperate question. Where will we find water? What will we eat? How will we protect ourselves from the sun, the scorpions, the serpents, and the hostile tribes that roam these wastes? Suddenly, the more than 600,000 men on foot, plus women and children, a population easily numbering over 2 million people, are entirely dependent on something they cannot see or control. They are dependent on the God who led them here. Their journey into the wilderness is not just a geographical transition, it's a spiritual one. They are moving from a state of physical bondage to a state of total reliance on their divine liberator. This 40-year period is meant to be a time of forging, a time for a nation of slaves to unlearn the habits of slavery, to learn the laws of their new king, and to be shaped into a people worthy of entering the land he has promised them. It is, in essence, a divine boot camp. And like any boot camp, it will be grueling. The tests will be severe, and the failures will have consequences. The plagues and diseases we encounter here in the desert are of a different character than those in Egypt. The Egyptian plagues were a public spectacle, a cosmic battle of the gods performed for the world to see. The wilderness plagues are a family matter. They are internal, disciplinary actions, born not from a conflict between God and a foreign king, but from the fraught, intimate, and often dysfunctional relationship between God and his own chosen and chronically complaining people. Their euphoria lasts for all of 3 days. After leaving the Red Sea, they travel for 3 days into the desert of Shur and find no water. The supplies they brought from Egypt are gone. The canteens are empty. The children are crying. The initial joy of freedom gives way to the primal, terrifying fear of thirst. The human body can't last long without water, especially under a desert sun. What felt like a triumphant march now feels like a death march. Then they find it, an oasis, a place named Mara. The relief must have been overwhelming. They rush to the water's edge, only to find that it is bitter, undrinkable. The name Mara, in fact, means bitter. And in their bitterness, the people turn on their leader. They murmured against Moses, a word that will become the sad, recurring chorus of their wilderness journey. What shall we drink? They demand. This is the first test and their first failure. Their immediate response to hardship is not prayer or remembrance of the miracles they just witnessed, but complaint and accusation. Moses, for his part, cries out to the Lord. He doesn't have the answer, but he knows who does. God shows him a piece of wood. Moses throws it into the water, and the bitter water becomes sweet. A simple act, a miraculous result. Chemically, some have suggested the wood may have come from a plant with properties that could precipitate the minerals, making the water bitter. But the text presents it as a direct act of God. More importantly, it is at this moment, right after their first complaint and first provision, that God lays out the terms of their relationship in the wilderness. He says, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. For I am the Lord, your healer." The connection is made explicit from the very beginning. Obedience leads to health and protection. Disobedience leads to disease. God is presented as both the potential source of affliction, like in Egypt, and the ultimate source of healing. Health in the wilderness is not just a matter of finding clean water. It is a matter of spiritual fidelity. This principle will govern everything that follows. Soon after, the next crisis hits: hunger. They are now in the desert of Sin, a month and a half out from Egypt. The food they plundered from the Egyptians is gone. Staring out at the barren landscape, they are overwhelmed by a nostalgic, selective amnesia. They remember Egypt not as the house of bondage, but as a place of plenty. "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt," they wail to Moses and Aaron, "when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." It's a shocking statement. They would rather have died as well-fed slaves than live as hungry but free people. The trauma of slavery runs deep, and the fear of the unknown is proving more powerful than the memory of their miraculous deliverance. God's response is one of patient grace. He tells Moses he has heard their grumbling and will provide. He will rain bread from heaven for them. And so begins the miracle of manna. Every morning, except on the Sabbath, the ground would be covered with a fine, flake-like substance, like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. The people were to gather just enough for one day. If they tried to hoard it, it would breed worms and stink by the next morning. It was a daily lesson in trust and dependence. They could not store up for the future. They had to rely on God's provision for each new day. In the evenings, God also provided meat, sending flocks of quail that would settle in the camp, easy to catch. For a time, this system works, but human nature is restless. In the book of Numbers, chapter 11, we find the people complaining again. They've grown tired of the manna. The daily miracle has become a boring routine. "Oh, that we had meat to eat," they cry. "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for free, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." Their craving for the savory, diverse foods of Egypt becomes an obsession. The text says they wept in their tents, and God's anger was kindled greatly. This time, the provision comes with a severe judgment. God promises to give them meat, not for a day or a week, but for a whole month, until it comes out at your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord. A great wind blows up from the sea and brings a massive flock of quail, which fall in and around the camp for miles in every direction, piled several feet deep. The people are ecstatic. For 2 days and a night, they gather the birds greedily, far more than they could possibly need. But as the text says, while the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. What was this plague? The text doesn't specify the medical details, but it's not hard to imagine. A massive number of birds, dying and dead in the desert heat, would have spoiled almost instantly. The people, gorging themselves on this improperly prepared and likely contaminated meat, could easily have contracted a severe form of food poisoning, like salmonella or botulism, or an avian disease, a widespread, virulent outbreak of gastroenteritis, leading to dehydration and death. Fits the description perfectly. The place was named Kibroth Hattava, which means graves of craving or graves of lust, a permanent memorial to the fact that their gluttonous desire, their rejection of God's perfect provision in favor of their own selfish appetites, had led directly to their deaths. It's a powerful and grim lesson. God can provide for your needs, but when you demand He satisfy your cravings on your own terms, that provision can become a curse. The very thing they lusted after became the instrument of their destruction. This event establishes a critical theme. The people's own sin, in this case, ungratefulness and gluttony, is the direct cause of the plague that afflicts them. This pattern of crisis, complaint, provision, and sometimes punishment is the rhythm of the wilderness. They run out of water again at a place called Rephidim. Again, they quarrel with Moses, accusing him of bringing them out to the desert to die of thirst. God instructs Moses to take his staff, the same one he used in Egypt, and strike a specific rock at Horeb. When he does, water gushes forth, enough for the entire nation and their livestock. This place would be named Massa, testing, and Meribah, quarreling, because the people tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Their question reveals a deep spiritual insecurity. Despite the daily manna, despite the pillar of cloud and fire that leads them, they constantly need fresh proof of God's presence. It is here at Rephidim that they face their first external human threat. A tribe of desert nomads, the Amalekites, attacks them. This isn't a plague of disease, but an affliction of violence. The Israelites are not a trained army, they are a rabble of former slaves. A young man named Joshua is chosen to lead the fight, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur go to the top of a hill overlooking the battle. What follows is a strange and symbolic scene. As long as Moses holds his hands up, holding the staff of God, the Israelites prevail. But when his arms grow tired and he lowers them, the Amalekites gain the upper hand. So Aaron and Hur find a stone for him to sit on, and then stand on either side of him, holding his arms up until sunset. The battle is won not by superior military strategy, but by an act of sustained, supported intercession. It's a physical demonstration of their reliance on God's power. This battle serves to teach them that their survival depends not just on God's provision for their physical needs, but also on His power to defeat their enemies, a power that is accessed through faithful leadership and prayer. However, the most significant early rebellion, the one that sets the tone for much of what is to come, happens at the foot of Mount Sinai itself. While Moses is up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving the law, receiving the very blueprints for their society and their worship, the 10 Commandments, the people below grow restless. Moses is gone too long. In their anxiety and fear, they revert to what they know. They go to Aaron and demand, "Up, make us gods who shall go before us." As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. It is a complete spiritual collapse. They reduce Moses from a prophet of God to just this Moses, the man. They have lost faith in their invisible God and demand a visible, tangible replacement. And Aaron, in a moment of shocking weakness, capitulates. He tells them to bring their gold earrings, and he melts them down, fashioning the gold into a molten calf, an idol reminiscent of the bull gods of Egypt, like Apis. The people declare, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." They build an altar, offer sacrifices, and engage in what the text calls revelry, which likely included pagan fertility rites. They have broken the first 2 commandments, to have no other gods, and to make no graven images, before Moses has even come down the mountain with the stone tablets on which they are written. Up on the mountain, God informs Moses of the people's apostasy, his anger burning. He offers to destroy the entire nation and start over with Moses. But Moses intercedes. In a powerful prayer, he appeals to God's own reputation and his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He stands in the gap for his rebellious people, and God relents from the disaster he had planned. But judgment must still fall. When Moses comes down the mountain and sees the calf and the dancing, his own anger flares. He smashes the stone tablets at the foot of the mountain, a dramatic symbol of their broken covenant. He burns the golden calf, grinds it to powder, scatters it on the water, and makes the Israelites drink it. A bitter, gritty dose of the physical evidence of their sin. Then he calls for those who are on the Lord's side to rally to him. The tribe of Levi, his own tribe, responds. He gives them a terrible command: to go through the camp with their swords and kill their brothers, friends, and neighbors who were leading the idolatry. About 3,000 men are killed that day. It's a brutal, bloody purging of the sin from their midst. But the punishment doesn't end there. After this internal judgment by the Levites, the text adds a final, ominous verse. And the Lord sent a plague on the people because of what they did with the calf that Aaron had made. Once again, sin leads to plague. The narrative doesn't give us the details of this plague. It could have been a sudden outbreak of disease that followed the slaughter. Perhaps the water they were forced to drink, now contaminated with the powdered gold and whatever else, made them sick. Or it could be that the plague was a more general term for a period of divine disfavor, of ongoing sickness and death that afflicted the camp as a result of their great transgression. Whatever its form, its cause was explicit. This wasn't a random outbreak. It was the direct consequence of their idolatry. They had chosen another god, and the result was death. This event at Sinai solidifies the link between covenant breaking and disease. The health of the nation is inextricably tied to its spiritual faithfulness. For nearly 40 years, this cycle continues. They journey, they face hardship, they complain, they sin, and they face judgment. One of the most stark and tragic examples of this occurs on the plains of Moab, just as they are on the cusp of finally entering the promised land. The 40 years of wandering are nearly over. The generation that came out of Egypt has died off, punished for their lack of faith when the spies returned with a fearful report about Canaan. A new generation has grown up in the desert, and they are now camped opposite Jericho. The Moabite king Balak is terrified of this massive nation on his border. He hires a prophet named Balaam to curse them, but God turns Balaam's curses into blessings. Unable to curse them supernaturally, Balaam apparently gives Balak some insidious advice on how to defeat them from within. The book of Numbers, chapter 25, tells us what happened. The Israelite men began to whore with the women of Moab. These were not casual encounters. The Moabite women invited the men to the sacrifices of their gods. The men ate the sacrificial meals and bowed down to their gods, specifically the Baal of Peor. This was a catastrophic failure on multiple levels. It was sexual immorality, a violation of the covenant's moral laws. More than that, it was a profound act of spiritual adultery. They were joining themselves to foreign gods through pagan sexual rituals. This syncretism, this blending of the worship of the Lord with the worship of idols, was the very thing the law warned against most strongly. It was a direct assault on the holiness and exclusivity of their covenant with God. The divine response was immediate and furious. God's anger was kindled, and a plague broke out among the people. The death toll was staggering. Moses, at God's command, orders the leaders of Israel to kill all the men who had yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. But while the community is weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting, a shocking act of defiance takes place. An Israelite man named Zimri brazenly walks past Moses and the elders, bringing a Midianite woman named Cosbi into his tent in plain sight of everyone. It was an act of flagrant, contemptuous rebellion. Phinehas, the son of the high priest Eleazar, sees this. Filled with what the text calls a righteous zeal, he takes a spear, goes into the tent, and drives the spear through both Zimri and Cosbi, killing them together. The text is graphic and brutal, and at that moment of violent justice, the plague was stopped, but not before it had claimed 24,000 lives. The plague of Baal Peor is a chilling example of the biblical connection between sin and consequence. The sin was a toxic mix of lust and idolatry, a betrayal of their covenant with God. The plague was the swift and deadly result. Phinehas's act, while shocking to our modern sensibilities, is presented in the text as the necessary surgical intervention that stopped the spiritual and physical disease from consuming the entire nation. It demonstrated that sin within the camp would not be tolerated, that the holiness of the community had to be defended at all costs. This event would be remembered for centuries as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assimilation and the deadly consequences of turning away from God to the idols of the surrounding cultures. It was a lesson written in the blood of 24,000 people. Not all the afflictions were punishments for such dramatic sins as idolatry. Sometimes the cause was the familiar, grinding chorus of complaint. In Numbers chapter 21, the people are traveling a difficult route around the land of Edom. Their patience is exhausted, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. They are speaking of the manna, the miraculous bread from heaven that has sustained them for decades. The daily miracle has become an object of contempt. This time, the judgment comes from the ground beneath their feet. The text says, "The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died." The term fiery serpent likely refers to the burning sensation of the snake's venom. The Araba Valley, through which they were likely traveling, is known to be home to some of the region's most venomous snakes, including the saw-scaled viper, whose bite causes severe local pain, swelling, and often fatal hemorrhaging. A sudden mass infestation of these snakes in the camp would have been a terrifying and deadly ordeal. People would be dying in agony, with no known cure. In their terror, the people come to Moses and confess, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." They recognize the connection between their words and their suffering. Moses prays, and God provides a very strange remedy. He does not take the snakes away. The danger remains. Instead, he tells Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live." So Moses forges a serpent out of bronze and lifts it up on a pole in the center of the camp. And a miracle occurs. Anyone who was bitten by a real serpent, no matter how deadly the venom coursing through their veins, could simply look at this bronze image and be healed. It was an act that required faith. The victim had to believe the promise, turn their eyes away from their wound and their fear, and look to the symbol God had provided. It was a cure that made no medical sense. It was purely an act of grace, accessed through a simple act of looking in faith. This story of the Nehushtan, the bronze serpent, is one of the most powerful in the wilderness narrative. It illustrates a profound theological point. The cure for their affliction was not the removal of the trial, but the provision of a means of salvation in the midst of it. They still had to live with the snakes, but they now had an answer to their deadly bite. This story resonated so deeply that centuries later, Jesus himself would use it as a metaphor for his own crucifixion. In the Gospel of John, he tells Nicodemus, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." The bronze serpent, a symbol of the very thing that was killing them, became the source of their healing when lifted up. In the same way, Jesus, by being lifted up on the cross and taking the venom of human sin upon himself, would become the source of eternal life for all who look to him in faith. The desert plague of fiery serpents became a foreshadowing of the gospel itself. The wilderness journey, then, was a 40-year education in the character of God and the nature of humanity. The plagues and afflictions that punctuated this journey were the harshest of lessons. They were never random. They were always connected to the spiritual state of the people. The graves of craving at Kibroth Hattaavah were a lesson in gratitude and contentment. The plague after the golden calf was a lesson in the supreme folly of idolatry. The 24,000 deaths at Baal Peor served as a brutal warning against the dangers of moral and spiritual compromise. The fiery serpents taught them that the remedy for sin's bite is to look in faith to the salvation God provides. These events were designed to purge the slave mentality from the Israelites. A slave complains, but does not take responsibility. A slave is concerned only with the needs of the moment, the meat pots of Egypt, and not with the promise of the future. A slave is tempted to return to the familiar, even if it is a place of bondage. Through these harsh trials, God was forging a nation of free people who understood the weight of their covenant, the holiness of their God, and the direct connection between their actions and their fate. The desert was a crucible, and the plagues were part of the fire that burned away the dross. It was a painful, costly process, and an entire generation failed the test. But for the new generation that stood on the banks of the Jordan, ready to enter the land, these stories were their history, their identity, and their solemn warning. They had learned the hard way that survival in the presence of a holy God depends entirely on walking in his ways. After the tumultuous and often terrifying years in the desert, a new reality began to set in for the people of Israel. The 40 years of wandering were not just a punishment, they were a period of intense education. God was not merely a distant, miracle-working rescuer who had pulled them from Egypt. He was to be their king, their lawgiver, the very center of their national and personal lives. While camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, they received the law through Moses, a vast and detailed blueprint for creating a society unlike any other on earth. This was not just a collection of rules, but a comprehensive system designed to teach them about the very nature of their God, his holiness, his justice, and his desire to dwell among them. A central pillar of this new legal and spiritual framework was the concept of holiness, which was expressed through a complex system of ritual purity. The world was divided into categories: the clean and the unclean, the sacred and the profane. Certain foods were clean and could be eaten, others were unclean. Certain bodily functions rendered a person temporarily unclean. Contact with a dead body made one unclean. This system wasn't about hygiene in the modern sense, though some of the laws certainly had positive health benefits. Its primary purpose was symbolic. It was a constant physical reminder that to be in the presence of a perfectly holy God required a state of wholeness, order, and life. Uncleanliness, in its various forms, was associated with death, decay, disorder, and separation from God. Of all the forms of ritual uncleanness described in the law, one stood alone in its severity, its social consequences, and its terrifying symbolism. This was the condition known in Hebrew as tzarath. For centuries, this word has been translated into English as leprosy, and that single word conjures up horrifying images of disfigurement, contagion, and outcast colonies. But to truly understand what the Bible is talking about, we have to set aside our modern medical understanding of leprosy, the specific bacterial infection known as Hansen's disease, and enter the world of the ancient Israelite priest. For them, tzarath was something far broader, more mysterious, and more spiritually significant than a single diagnosis. It was a creeping corruption that could affect not only human skin, but the clothes they wore and the very walls of their homes. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of impurity, a condition that turned a person into a walking symbol of social and spiritual death. So what exactly was this biblical leprosy? The 13th chapter of the book of Leviticus is dedicated almost entirely to this question, providing a detailed diagnostic manual for the priests. It's a fascinating, if somewhat clinical, piece of writing. The text lays out the primary signs a priest was to look for on a person's skin: a swelling, an eruption or scab, or a bright, shiny spot. If within this spot the hair had turned white and the affliction appeared to be deeper than the skin of the body, then the diagnosis was clear. It was tzarath. The priest was to pronounce the person unclean, but often the signs were ambiguous. If the spot was white but didn't seem to be deep, and the hair hadn't turned white, the priest wouldn't make an immediate judgment. Instead, he would place the person in quarantine for 7 days. At the end of the week, he would examine them again. If the spot had not spread, he would quarantine them for another 7 days. Only after this second week, if the affliction was still contained and had faded, would the person be declared clean, having had a simple scab. But if at any point the spot was seen to be spreading on the skin, the diagnosis was confirmed. The key indicators were depth and spread, signs of an active, invasive, and uncontrolled condition. Another clear sign was the appearance of raw, living flesh within the white spot. This combination of diseased tissue and raw flesh was an immediate and definitive sign of uncleanness. Interestingly, the text makes a strange distinction. If the tzarath spread so much that it covered the person's entire body, from head to foot, turning all their skin white, the priest would pronounce them clean. This seems counterintuitive, but the logic within the system makes sense. The danger, the uncleanness, was in the mixture of healthy and diseased tissue, the active, spreading boundary of the affliction. A condition that had finished its course, so to speak, and was now uniform and static, was no longer considered ritually impure. It was a settled condition, not an active corruption. From these detailed descriptions, modern scholars and medical professionals have concluded that Sarath was a broad, catch-all term for a wide variety of skin diseases. It almost certainly included what we know as Hansen's disease, particularly in its tuberculoid form, which involves discolored skin patches. But it also likely encompassed a host of other conditions that were common in the ancient world. Things like severe psoriasis, with its raised, scaly patches, ringworm, and other fungal infections, favus, for example, could cause yellowish crusts and hair loss. Chronic eczema, vitiligo, a non-contagious condition that causes patches of skin to lose their pigment and turn white, and perhaps even skin cancers. The priests of ancient Israel weren't making a medical diagnosis in our sense. They weren't identifying a specific bacterium or pathogen. They were making a ritual diagnosis. They were looking for the outward, physical signs of something that, in their worldview, represented chaos, decay, and death encroaching upon the living body. The spreading nature of the affliction was a visible sign of a loss of wholeness, a breakdown of the body's normal, healthy state, which made the individual unfit to enter the sacred space of the community and the sanctuary. One of the most remarkable things about the laws of Sarath is who was in charge of the diagnosis. It wasn't a physician or a healer. It was the priest. A person suspected of having the disease was to be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons. This tells us that the primary concern was not medical treatment, but the ritual status of the individual and the protection of the community's holiness. The priest acted as a kind of public health officer and theological gatekeeper combined. His role was to examine the physical evidence and render a judgment that had profound social and spiritual consequences. Imagine the terror of that process. You discover a strange spot on your skin. You try to ignore it, but it doesn't go away. Maybe it gets bigger. Your family sees it. The whispers start. Finally, you have no choice but to present yourself to the priest. You stand before him, stripping off your garment to reveal the mark on your body. He inspects it closely, his face unreadable. He feels the texture, looks for white hairs, assesses its depth, and then he delivers the verdict. Perhaps it is the relief of being declared clean, or perhaps it is the dreadful uncertainty of being shut up in quarantine for 7 days, isolated with your fear and anxiety, waiting for a second examination that will decide your fate. The 7-day quarantine was a period of intense liminality. You were neither clean nor unclean, neither fully in the community nor fully cast out. Your life was on hold. Every day you would examine the spot yourself, praying that it would fade, that it would not spread. And then the priest would return. Another examination, another moment of judgment. The process was deliberate, careful, and for the person involved, surely agonizing. The priest's pronouncement, clean or unclean, was not a medical opinion. It was a legally and spiritually binding declaration that would instantly change every aspect of your existence. His authority in this matter was absolute, derived directly from the divine law. His role was to guard the boundary between the sacred and the profane, and a person with active, spreading Tsaroth was the embodiment of the profane, a living breach in the wall of the community's holiness. If the priest's final verdict was unclean, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Life, as the person knew, it was over. Leviticus 13:45-46 outlines the grim ritual that followed. The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Every part of this was a symbol of death and mourning. Tearing one's clothes and letting one's hair be unkempt were signs of a mourner grieving a death. In this case, it was a grief for one's own life. Covering the upper lip was also a sign of shame or mourning. The constant cry of unclean, unclean, served as a verbal warning, a way to keep others at a distance, ensuring no one would accidentally become contaminated by contact. It was a forced confession, a constant verbalization of one's own polluted state. You were forced to become the agent of your own ostracism. The final edict, "He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp," was the most profound blow. To be sent outside the camp was to be cut off from everything that defined you. The camp was the sphere of community, family, and economic life. It was also the sphere of God's presence, centered on the tabernacle. To be cast out was to be rendered a non-person. You could no longer work your trade, live with your spouse and children, or share a meal with your friends. You were socially dead. Even more tragically, you were spiritually exiled. You could not enter the court of the tabernacle, could not offer a sacrifice, could not participate in the great festivals. You were cut off from the organized worship of the God of Israel. It was a living death, a state of perpetual exile within sight of your own home. The psychological toll of this existence is hard to fathom. The loneliness would have been crushing, the shame overwhelming. You were seen by others as a walking embodiment of sin, even though the law does not explicitly state that Tsaroth was always a punishment for a specific sin. While there are narrative examples of this, Miriam is struck with it for speaking against Moses, King Uzziah for arrogantly entering the temple. In the legal texts of Leviticus, it is treated simply as a state of being, a ritual impurity that must be dealt with regardless of its cause. Nevertheless, in the popular imagination, the connection would have been strong. You were marked not just on your skin, but in the eyes of your neighbors. You were a reminder of human frailty, of corruption, and of the impenetrable barrier between a holy God and an unclean person. Your days would be spent wandering in the wilderness, outside the city walls, dependent on the charity of others. Your only identity, the cry that came from your covered lips. Unclean, unclean. The concept of Tsaroth was so pervasive that it extended beyond human flesh. The law recognized that this creeping, corrupting influence could also appear in the inanimate objects that made up a person's world. Leviticus provides diagnostic criteria for Tsaroth in garments and in houses. A greenish or reddish patch appearing in a woolen or linen garment or in a piece of leather was to be shown to the priest. The priest would quarantine the object for 7 days. If the patch had spread, the garment was considered to have a malignant Tsaroth. It was unclean and had to be burned. Fire was the ultimate purifier, the only way to completely destroy the contamination. If it had not spread, the garment was washed and quarantined for another 7 days. If the patch had faded, it was clean, but the affected part had to be cut out. This seems bizarre to us. What could this leprosy of fabric possibly be? Most likely, it was a form of mold or mildew. Certain types of fungi could produce discoloration and begin to break down the fibers of the cloth, which would fit the description of a spreading, corrupting plague. Treating it with the same seriousness as a skin disease underscores the symbolic nature of the law. The principle was that any sign of invasive decay, whether on a living body or on the materials that touched that body, was a threat to ritual purity and had to be contained and, if necessary, eradicated. Even more dramatically, Tsaroth could afflict a house. The law in Leviticus 14 describes what should happen if a homeowner sees a leprous disease in his house, described as greenish or reddish streaks that appear to be deeper than the surface of the wall. Again, the priest is called. He orders the house to be emptied before he even enters, a compassionate detail so that the contents are not automatically declared unclean along with the house. After examining the streaks, he quarantines the house for 7 days. If the plague has spread, the contaminated stones must be torn out and cast into an unclean place outside the city. The walls are to be scraped and replastered with fresh mortar. If, after all this, the plague reappears, the diagnosis is grim. It is a malignant leprosy in the house. The entire structure is unclean. It must be completely demolished, its stones, its timber, its mortar, and all the debris hauled to an unclean place. Again, the likely culprit here is a virulent form of mold or fungus, perhaps what we would call toxic black mold, Stachybotrys chartarum, or something similar. Certain types of mold can be very destructive to a building's structure and can pose serious health risks. The Levitical law, in its own ritual language, prescribes a surprisingly practical and thorough method of remediation: quarantine, removal of affected materials, and, in the worst-case scenario, total demolition to prevent further spread. The house, like the human body, was seen as a complete entity. A spreading corruption within its walls made the entire structure ritually sick, just as a leper was exiled from the community of people. A leprous house was deconstructed and exiled from the community of dwellings. The principle remained the same. Holiness requires wholeness, and any encroaching, persistent decay must be purged from the midst of the people. But what if the impossible happened? What if a person diagnosed with Tsaroth got better? What if the skin condition healed, the raw flesh disappeared, and the spreading stopped? This was cause for great joy, but it was not the end of the story. Being physically healed did not automatically make one ritually clean. To be readmitted into the community, to be allowed back inside the camp, and into the presence of God at the tabernacle, required one of the most elaborate and symbolically rich cleansing rituals in the entire law. The 14th chapter of Leviticus details this two-stage, 8-day process of restoration. The first stage took place outside the camp. The priest would go out to the healed person to verify that the disease was truly gone. If it was, the ceremony of cleansing would begin. The formerly leprous person was to bring 2 clean living birds, a piece of cedar wood, a length of scarlet yarn, and a hyssop branch. The priest would command that one of the birds be killed in an earthenware vessel over living water, fresh, running water from a spring or stream. He would then take the living bird, the cedar wood, the scarlet yarn, and the hyssop, and dip them all in the blood of the slain bird mixed with the living water. He would sprinkle this blood-water mixture on the person being cleansed 7 times, and then he would pronounce him clean. Finally, he would release the living bird to fly away into the open field. Every element of this ritual was steeped in symbolism. The 2 birds represented the person's state. One died, representing the death of the old, unclean state. The other, stained with the blood of the first, but set free, represented the person themselves, now cleansed by that substitutionary death and released into a new life. Cedar wood was known for its resistance to decay, symbolizing permanence and preservation. Scarlet yarn, the color of blood, symbolized life itself. Hyssop was a common plant used for purification rituals. The 7-fold sprinkling was a number of perfection and completion. This beautiful, dramatic ceremony declared the person's initial cleansing and their freedom from the death of their former condition. After this, the person could re-enter the camp, but they were not yet fully restored. They had to wash their clothes, shave off all their hair from their head, their beard, their eyebrows, and bathe in water. Shaving off all the hair was a symbol of removing every last trace of the old, diseased state and starting completely fresh. They could now live inside the camp, but they had to remain outside their own tent for another 7 days. On the 7th day, they would shave and bathe again. This week-long period was a gradual reintegration, a time of transition back into normal life. The 8th day marked the climax of the restoration. The person would go to the entrance of the tabernacle, the very place they had been forbidden to approach, and present a series of sacrifices to the Lord. This was the final step, the one that restored their relationship with God. The main offering was a guilt offering. The priest would take some of the blood from this sacrificed lamb and dab it on the tip of the person's right ear, the thumb of their right hand, and the big toe of their right foot. Then he would take holy oil and dab it on top of the blood in the same 3 places. This was an extraordinary act. This specific ritual of anointing the ear, thumb, and toe was otherwise only used for one purpose: the consecration of a priest by applying the symbols of atonement, blood and consecration, oil, to the very extremities of the person's body. The ritual was reconsecrating their whole being to God. Their hearing, ear, their actions, hand, and their walk, foot, were all being rededicated. They were not just being declared clean, they were being made holy again, fit to be a member of God's kingdom of priests. After this, further sin offerings and burnt offerings were made to complete the atonement. Only after this complex, 8-day process was the person fully restored. They could return to their tent, to their family, and to the worshiping assembly. They were, in a sense, reborn. The ritual was long, expensive, and public, a powerful statement to the entire community about the high cost of restoration and the sheer joy of being brought back from a state of living death into the full light of life and fellowship. Biblical leprosy, or tzarath, was therefore so much more than a medical problem. It was a physical condition that triggered a social catastrophe and represented a profound spiritual state. It was a visible metaphor for the nature of sin itself, how it defiles, how it spreads, how it isolates us from God and from each other, how it leads to a state of living death. The detailed laws surrounding it were a constant, tangible lesson for the Israelites about the importance of holiness, the danger of corruption, and the necessity of purification. It taught them that God cared not just about their hearts, but about their bodies, their clothes, their homes. Their entire existence was to be ordered and whole, and in the elaborate rituals for cleansing, it provided a powerful picture of grace, showing that even from the most hopeless state of exile and impurity, there was a path back to wholeness and communion, a path paved with sacrifice, atonement, and rebirth. We've journeyed from the grand, external spectacle of the plagues in Egypt to the internal, disciplinary afflictions of the wilderness. We've delved into the intricate and deeply symbolic laws of tzarath, where the purity of the individual was paramount to the holiness of the community. Now, our story takes another significant turn. The Israelites are no longer a wandering tribe, nor a fledgling nation finding its feet. They have entered the promised land, conquered much of it, and have done something they were warned against, yet insisted upon. They have asked for a king. With the rise of the monarchy, first under Saul, then David, then Solomon, and through the long, complex history of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the dynamic between God, the people, and divine judgment shifts once more. In this new era, the king stands as a singular figure, a federal head who represents the entire nation before God. He is the shepherd of the people, the commander of the army, the chief justice, and most importantly, the covenant representative. His personal faithfulness, or lack thereof, now has staggering, nationwide implications. The health and security of the entire kingdom are often depicted as being directly tied to the spiritual and moral state of the man sitting on the throne. As goes the king, so goes the nation. Plagues and diseases in this period of biblical history, therefore, often serve as a divine commentary on the quality of leadership. They are no longer just about communal grumbling or individual impurity. They are about royal pride, idolatry, and injustice. The suffering of the people becomes a direct reflection of the sin of their monarch, a terrible and potent lesson in corporate responsibility. Our first story from this period, however, doesn't focus on an Israelite king, but on their perennial antagonists, the Philistines. And the plague is not caused by a king's sin, but by a nation's arrogance in the face of God's holiness, embodied in a single sacred object, the Ark of the Covenant. The story, found in the first book of Samuel, is a powerful and almost grimly humorous account of what happens when the sacred is treated as a superstition. The Israelites are at war with the Philistines and are losing badly. In a moment of desperation, they decide to use the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm. They bring it from its resting place in Shiloh into the battle camp, thinking its mere presence will guarantee victory. The Philistines are terrified when they hear the God of Israel is in the camp. But instead of running, they fight even harder and win a crushing victory. They not only kill 30,000 Israelite soldiers, but they also capture the ark itself. For Israel, this is a national catastrophe of the highest order. The tangible symbol of God's presence and covenant with them is now in enemy hands. The Philistines, flushed with victory, take the ark to Ashdod, one of their 5 major cities, and place it in the temple of their chief god, Dagon, as a trophy of war. They set it right next to the statue of Dagon, as if to say, "Our God has defeated yours." The next morning, the priests of Dagon enter the temple and find a strange sight. The statue of Dagon has fallen on its face before the Ark of the Covenant, as if in prostration. A bit embarrassing, but they simply set their idol back up on its pedestal. The morning after that, however, the scene is far more decisive. Dagon has fallen on its face before the ark again, but this time its head and both its hands are broken off, lying on the threshold. Only the torso, the stump of Dagon, remains. The message is clear and humiliating. The God of the Philistines is no God at all. He cannot even remain standing in the presence of the ark of the God of Israel. But the humiliation of their idol is only the beginning of their problems. The text tells us, "The hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory." A painful, frightening plague breaks out. The Hebrew word for tumors, aphel, is a bit obscure and is sometimes translated as hemorrhoids, but it likely refers to some kind of painful swelling or boil, perhaps buboes, like those associated with the bubonic plague. The people of Ashdod quickly realize this is no coincidence. "The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us," they cry, "for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God." So they decide to move the ark to another of their cities, Gath. The result is the same. As soon as the ark arrives, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing a very great panic, and he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. The plague followed the ark, the people of Gath, in turn, try to send the ark to the city of Ekron. But the Ekronites see it coming and panic, crying out, "They have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people." The plague strikes Ekron even more fiercely, and the text adds a grim detail. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. But it wasn't just tumors. A second element to the plague is revealed a little later. The land was also being ravaged by mice. This combination is horribly suggestive of bubonic plague, a bacterial infection carried by fleas that live on rodents. An explosion in the rodent population would lead to a widespread outbreak of the disease, which is characterized by the painful swelling of lymph nodes, buboes, or tumors. Whether it was bubonic plague or another affliction, the Philistines understood it as a supernatural attack. For 7 months, the ark remains in their land, bringing death and disease wherever it goes. Finally, their leaders have had enough. They call for their priests and diviners and ask what they should do. Their experts' advice is fascinating. They recognize that this is the work of the God of Israel, and that they must send the ark back with a guilt offering to appease his anger. They warn the Philistine lords not to harden their hearts, as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did. The story of the Exodus was well known in the ancient world. It was a cautionary tale for any nation that trifled with the God of the Hebrews. The guilt offering they devise is highly symbolic. They are to make 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, one for each of the 5 lords of the Philistines. By creating golden images of the very things that were plaguing them, they were acknowledging the source of their affliction and offering a symbolic payment for their transgression. They then place the ark and the golden offerings on a brand new cart, hitched to 2 milk cows that have never been yoked and whose calves have been taken from them. The test is this: if the cows, against all their natural instinct to return to their calves, walk straight down the road toward the Israelite territory of Beth-Shemesh, then the Philistines will know for certain that this plague was from the God of Israel. If they don't, it was just a coincidence. The cows, of course, head straight for Beth-Shemesh, lowing as they go, never turning to the right or to the left. The Philistine lords follow at a distance and watch. The ark is back in Israelite hands. The story serves as a powerful lesson about the nature of God's holiness. It is not a magic charm to be manipulated, as the Israelites tried to do, nor is it a mere trophy to be disrespected, as the Philistines did. God's presence, symbolized by the ark, is a source of immense power. For those under the covenant who approach it with reverence and obedience, it is a source of blessing. But for those who treat it with contempt or casual arrogance, that same power becomes a source of terrifying and deadly judgment. The Philistine plague was a 7-month ordeal that taught them a lesson they would never forget. The God of Israel was not to be trifled with. The most famous and direct example of a king's sin leading to a national plague, however, involves Israel's greatest king, David. The story is told in both 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21. and it takes place late in David's reign, when the kingdom is secure and prosperous. The story begins ominously. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go, number Israel and Judah." The version in Chronicles clarifies that it was Satan who stood up against Israel and incited David. Regardless of the ultimate source of the temptation, the action is David's own. He commands his ruthless but loyal general Joab to conduct a military census, to count all the fighting men in the kingdom. Joab, who is rarely a voice of conscience, is immediately opposed to the idea. He sees the spiritual danger in it. "May the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are," he says to David. "But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" Joab's protest gives us a clue as to why this act was so sinful. A census in the ancient world was primarily for two purposes: taxation and military conscription. By counting his soldiers, David was shifting his trust from God, who had given him all his victories, to the tangible, quantifiable strength of his own army. It was an act of pride and self-reliance, a way of measuring his own glory. It violated the fundamental principle that Israel's strength lay not in its numbers, but in its God. Furthermore, the people belonged to God, not to David, and by numbering them as his own resource, he was overstepping his bounds as king. But David overrides Joab's objections, and for nearly 10 months, the census takers go throughout the land, from one end to the other. They return with the number 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword in Israel, and 500,000 in Judah. The numbers vary slightly in Chronicles, but the scale is the same. It is a massive army, a testament to the kingdom's power. But as soon as the numbers are reported, David's conscience awakens. The text says, David's heart struck him. He confesses to the Lord, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly." His confession is sincere, but the sin has been committed, and it will have consequences. The next morning, the prophet Gad, David's seer, comes to him with a message from God. Because of his sin, David is to be given a choice of 3 punishments: 3 years of famine in the land, 3 months of fleeing from his enemies while they pursue him, or 3 days of pestilence, a plague from the Lord, with the angel of the Lord working destruction throughout Israel. It is a terrible choice. Each option involves widespread suffering for his people, the very people he has sinned against by his pride. David's response is profound. "I am in great distress," he says to Gad. "Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man." He chooses the 3 days of plague. His reasoning is a flash of theological insight. Famine can be managed and manipulated by the powerful. War is the work of human cruelty, but a plague is a direct act of God, and in the hands of God, there is at least the possibility of mercy. It is a humble and wise choice, born of terror and a deep-seated trust in God's character over human character. So the pestilence begins. The text doesn't describe the symptoms, only the horrifying result. the angel of the Lord moves through the land, and in that short time, 70,000 people die, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. The kingdom is decimated. The king's pride has been paid for with the lives of his people. The climax of the story is both terrifying and beautiful. The plague reaches Jerusalem, and the angel of the Lord is poised to destroy the capital city, his hand outstretched over it, a drawn sword in his hand. But God sees the devastation, and the text says, he relented from the disaster. He says to the destroying angel, "It is enough, now stay your hand." At that moment, David looks up and sees the angel standing by the thrashing floor of a man named Araunah the Jebusite. A thrashing floor was a high, flat place where grain was processed, often on a hilltop. Seeing the agent of destruction poised over his beloved city, David is broken. He and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fall on their faces. David cries out to God, "Was it not I who commanded that the people be numbered? It is I who have sinned and done very wickedly. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house." In this moment, David is a true shepherd king, offering his own life to save his flock. His prayer is heard. The prophet Gad comes to him with one final instruction: go up and erect an altar to the Lord on the thrashing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David goes immediately. Araunah sees the king coming and offers to give him the thrashing floor, the oxen for the sacrifice, everything he needs for free. But David refuses. "No," he says, in a phrase that has echoed through the centuries, "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." He insists on buying the thrashing floor and the oxen for the full price of 50 shekels of silver. Chronicles mentions a much larger sum for the entire site. He buys the land, builds an altar on the very spot where judgment was about to fall, and offers sacrifices. And the text concludes, "So the Lord responded to the plea for the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped." This story is foundational for everything that comes after. It is the ultimate example of a king's sin bringing national calamity. It is a story of pride, repentance, and divine mercy. And most critically, the very piece of land that David buys, the place where judgment was halted by sacrifice, becomes the site where his son, Solomon, would build the great temple. The place of judgment becomes the place of atonement, the very center of Israel's worship for centuries to come. The plague that almost destroyed Jerusalem ended up consecrating the ground on which its holy temple would stand. Sometimes the divine judgment for a king's sin was not a plague on the people, but a disease that struck the monarch himself, a personal and often deeply symbolic affliction. A powerful example is King Uzziah of Judah, described in 2 Chronicles 26. Uzziah was one of Judah's most successful kings. He reigned for 52 years, was a brilliant military strategist, a great builder, and we are told that as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper, but his success became his undoing. The text says, "But when he was strong, he grew proud to his own destruction. His pride took the form of religious arrogance." One day, he decided to enter the holy place of the temple to burn incense on the altar of incense. This was a shocking violation of sacred protocol. The burning of incense was a holy duty reserved exclusively for the consecrated priests, the descendants of Aaron. Uzziah, as king, was the head of the state, but he was not the head of the priesthood. He was blurring the lines, usurping a role that was not his. The high priest, Azariah, and 80 other valiant priests went in after him and confronted him. "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord," they told him, "but for the priests. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have done wrong." Instead of humbling himself, Uzziah became enraged. As he stood there in the temple, holding the censer, his face contorted with fury at the priests, a dreadful thing happened. Zarath, biblical leprosy, broke out on his forehead. The priests saw the mark of the disease and rushed him out. Uzziah himself, in his terror, hurried to leave because the Lord had struck him. The poetic justice was devastatingly precise. For his sin of proudly intruding into the sacred space where only the holy could go, he was afflicted with the very disease that symbolized uncleanness and resulted in permanent exclusion from that sacred space. King Uzziah was a leper for the rest of his life. He was forced to live in a separate house, cut off from the temple and from the administration of his own kingdom. His son, Jotham, governed in his place. The king who had reached the pinnacle of power and pride was brought low by a skin disease, a living testament to the fact that no earthly authority could violate the holiness of God with impunity. An even more gruesome tale of royal affliction is that of King Jehoram of Judah, found in 2 Chronicles 21. Jehoram was the son of the good King Jehoshaphat, but he was a man of exceptional wickedness. He married a daughter of the idolatrous King Ahab of Israel, and he led Judah down the same path of Baal worship. To secure his throne, he murdered all 6 of his younger brothers. He was a tyrant who made his people prostitute themselves to foreign gods. Reign was a disaster. The kingdom was beset by revolts and invasions, but the final judgment was reserved for him personally. The great prophet Elijah, in one of his last recorded acts, sent a letter to Jehoram. It was a letter of pure condemnation, predicting his fate. Because Jehoram had forsaken the God of his fathers and led the nation into idolatry and murder, Elijah wrote, "Behold, the Lord will strike your people, your sons, your wives, and all your possessions with a great plague." And then the letter got personal. "And you yourself will have a severe sickness with a disease of your bowels, until your bowels come out because of the sickness, day by day." The prophecy unfolded exactly as written. The Philistines and Arabs invaded, plundered the palace, and carried off his wives and sons. And then the disease struck. The text says the Lord afflicted him with an incurable disease of the bowels. For 2 years, he suffered in agony, his condition worsening until, just as Elijah had prophesied, his bowels came out and he died in terrible pain. His end was as ignominious as his life. His own people made no fire in his honor, as they had for his ancestors, and he was not buried in the royal tombs. Jehoram's story is a stark and stomach-turning illustration of the principle of divine retribution. The national plague of invasion was followed by a personal plague of disease, a foul end for a foul king. But the narrative isn't only one of punishment. It also shows that the connection between a king's heart and his health could work in the other direction. The story of King Hezekiah's illness, told in 2 Kings 20 and Isaiah 38, is a beautiful counterpoint to the stories of Uzziah and Jehoram. Hezekiah was a righteous king, famous for his sweeping religious reforms and his steadfast trust in God during the Assyrian invasion. But at the height of his reign, he was struck with a life-threatening illness described as a boil. The prophet Isaiah came to his sickbed with a devastating message from God. "Set your house in order, for you shall die. You shall not recover." This was not a prediction. It was a death sentence. Upon hearing this, Hezekiah did not despair or curse his fate. He turned his face to the wall, away from the prophet and the royal court, and prayed a private, desperate, and heartfelt prayer. "Please, O Lord," he wept, "remember now how I have walked before you in faithfulness and with a whole heart, and have done what is good in your sight." He appealed to God on the basis of his covenant faithfulness. The response was immediate and miraculous. Before Isaiah had even crossed the middle court of the palace, the word of the Lord came to him again. "Turn back and say to Hezekiah, the leader of my people, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you." God not only reversed the death sentence, but also gave Hezekiah a remarkable promise. He would add 15 years to his life. To prove that this promise was real, God offered a supernatural sign. Hezekiah could choose to have the shadow on the royal sundial move forward 10 steps or backward 10 steps. Hezekiah chose the more difficult sign, backward, and the shadow on the sundial of Ahaz moved back 10 steps. After this divine promise, there was still a human element to the healing. Isaiah prescribed a simple, almost rustic remedy. Let them take a cake of figs and apply it to the boil, that he may recover. The fig poultice was applied, and the king was healed. This story is a profound illustration of the power of prayer and the mercy of God. Hezekiah's piety didn't make him immune to sickness, but his relationship with God gave him a recourse that the wicked kings did not have. He could appeal to God's covenant love, and God responded with grace, turning a fatal diagnosis into a renewed lease on life. The story shows that while a king's actions could bring about disease and judgment, a king's faithful heart could also bring about miraculous healing and deliverance. From the Ark of the Covenant plaguing the Philistines to a fig poultice healing a faithful king, the message throughout the era of the monarchy is consistent. The well-being of the nation was seen as a fragile thing, intimately linked to the spiritual integrity of its leaders. A king's pride could cost 70,000 lives. His arrogance could leave him a lonely leper. His wickedness could result in a horrifying, painful death. But his faithfulness and heartfelt prayer could turn back the shadow of death itself. These stories taught the people of Israel that leadership was a sacred trust, and the consequences of betraying that trust were written not just in the history books, but on the very bodies of the people and their kings. The land itself seemed to mirror the health of its ruler, flourishing under the righteous and suffering under the corrupt. This recurring theme of judgment and the need for perfect, righteous leadership would create a deep longing in the heart of the nation for a future king, a son of David who would not fail, who would not fall to pride, and who would finally bring lasting healing to his people. We have walked a long and often difficult road together. We began our journey in Egypt, amidst the terrifying and spectacular plagues that fell like divine hammer blows upon a proud empire, each one a direct challenge to its gods, and a declaration of the power of the God of the Hebrews. We then followed the Israelites into the Sinai wilderness, a vast and unforgiving landscape where the afflictions they suffered were not for foreign eyes, but were intimate, disciplinary lessons in the demanding nature of a holy covenant. We've seen how sin, be it idolatry, grumbling, or sexual immorality, was often followed by a swift and deadly plague, a physical consequence for a spiritual rebellion, sat with the intricate laws of Sarath, or biblical leprosy, and felt the profound desolation of being declared unclean, a state of social and spiritual death that required an elaborate, costly ritual to overcome. And we've stood in the courts of kings, watching as the fate of an entire nation hung on the pride or piety of its monarch, seeing how a king's sin could bring a pestilence that wiped out tens of thousands, or how his arrogance could be punished with a disease that mirrored his own transgression. Through all these stories, a certain pattern emerges. Disease and plague in the Old Testament are overwhelmingly portrayed as instruments of divine judgment, as consequences of sin, or as potent symbols of the separation between a holy God and a fallen, impure world. The primary response to these afflictions was often repentance, sacrifice, and a plea for God to relent. Healing was possible, but it was often on a grand national scale or through a meticulous ritual process. The world we have been exploring is one where sickness is deeply entangled with sin, and purity is a constant, precarious state to be guarded. Now, as our journey comes to its end, we step across the threshold into a new era. The world is different. The land of Israel is now a province under the thumb of the mighty Roman Empire. The great prophets have been silent for 400 years, but the air is thick with anticipation, a deep-seated longing for the fulfillment of the ancient promises, for the coming of a Messiah, a promised king from the line of David who would restore the fortunes of Israel. It is into this world of Roman legionaries, fervent religious sects, and messianic expectation that a man named Jesus of Nazareth appears. And with his arrival, the entire conversation about sickness, disease, and plagues is turned on its head. His public ministry, which lasts for roughly 3 years, is not characterized by calling down plagues upon the enemies of Israel. Instead, It is an astonishing, relentless, and revolutionary campaign of healing. He walks into a world afflicted by the consequences of sin, and rather than adding to the judgment, he begins to reverse it, one broken body at a time. The story of Jesus is the story of a direct, personal, and victorious confrontation with the very forces of disease, decay, and death that have haunted our journey from the beginning. Perhaps no single encounter demonstrates this revolutionary approach more powerfully than Jesus' healing of a leper, an event recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark's account is particularly vivid. As Jesus is teaching, a man with leprosy approaches him. We have to stop and appreciate how scandalous this single act is. This man, by law, should have been outside the city living alone, crying out, "Unclean, unclean," to warn everyone away. To approach a crowd, let alone a religious teacher, a rabbi, was a shocking breach of every social and religious custom. He was making everyone around him ritually unclean just by his proximity. He falls on his knees before Jesus, and his words are not a demand, but a perfect expression of desperate faith. "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." His statement is profound. He has no doubt about Jesus' ability. The question is not one of power, but of will. He knows Jesus can do it. He just doesn't know if Jesus will do it for him, an outcast, a man society had written off as spiritually and physically contaminated. He is asking about Jesus' character, about his heart. And Jesus' response is immediate and world-altering. The text says Jesus was moved with pity. He felt the man's suffering in his gut. And then he did the unthinkable. He stretched out his hand and touched him. Let that sink in. To touch a leper was to defy the law of Moses. It was to willingly invite ritual impurity upon oneself. Any other person in Israel who did this would have had to go through a purification ritual. The flow of contamination was supposed to be one way, from the unclean to the clean. But with Jesus, the opposite happens. When Jesus touches the unclean man, he is not made unclean. Instead, his perfect wholeness, his intrinsic purity, flows out of him into the leper. The flow of power is reversed. His touch does not contaminate, it cleanses. As he touches him, he speaks the words the man was desperate to hear. "I am willing, be clean." The healing is instantaneous and complete. Immediately, Mark says, the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. But Jesus' work is not done. The man's body is healed, but he is still a social and religious outcast until the law recognizes his healing. So Jesus gives him a stern warning not to publicize the miracle, but instead to fulfill his legal obligation. Go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing the gifts that Moses commanded for a proof to them. Jesus is not abolishing the law. He is fulfilling its ultimate purpose. He sends the man back into the very system that had cast him out, but now as a walking, breathing testament to a new and greater power. The priest, who had likely once pronounced this man unclean, would now have to examine him and declare him clean, forced to bear witness to a healing he could not explain. The costly and elaborate sacrifices the man would offer for his cleansing. The 2 birds, the lambs, all pointed to the need for atonement and restoration. In healing this man with a simple touch and a word, Jesus demonstrated that he himself was the source of that restoration. He didn't just heal a skin disease. He restored a man's life, his family, his community, and his access to God. This one encounter is a microcosm of his entire ministry, moving toward the outcast, touching the untouchable, and bringing a cleansing, restorative power that superseded the old order. A significant portion of the sickness described in the Gospels falls into a category that is unfamiliar to our modern, scientific worldview: demonic oppression. In the ancient world, the line between the physical and the spiritual was porous. While they certainly recognized ordinary illnesses, many conditions, especially those involving mental anguish, convulsions, or inexplicable behavior, were attributed to the influence of evil spirits. For Jesus, healing was often a form of spiritual warfare, a direct confrontation with the forces of darkness that held people in bondage. The most dramatic example of this is the story of the Gerasene demoniac, found in Mark chapter 5. When Jesus and his disciples crossed the Sea of Galilee into a Gentile region, they are immediately confronted by a man coming out of the tombs. His condition is described in terrifying detail. He is possessed by an unclean spirit. He lives among the burial caves, a place of death and impurity. He cannot be restrained. He shatters chains and shackles. Day and night, he wanders the hills, crying out and cutting himself with stones. He is a figure of pure, feral madness, a man completely alienated from human community, his body and mind a playground for destructive spiritual forces. When this man sees Jesus from a distance, the demons within him recognize Jesus immediately. He runs and bows down, and the spirit shrieks, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." It is a stunning admission of Jesus' authority from the spiritual underworld. Jesus asks for the spirit's name, and the famous reply comes, "My name is Legion, for we are many." A Roman legion consisted of thousands of soldiers. The name implies an overwhelming infestation of demonic power. The demons, knowing they are defeated, beg Jesus not to send them out of the country. Instead, they ask to be sent into a large herd of pigs feeding on a nearby hillside. Jesus gives them permission. The unclean spirits leave the man and enter the pigs, and the entire herd, about 2,000 of them, rushes down the steep bank into the sea and drowns. The healing of the man is accomplished through an act of explosive, destructive exorcism. The local people, terrified by the display of power and the massive loss of their livestock, come out to see what has happened. And they find the man who had been the local terror, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. He is calm. He is human again. The chaos within him has been replaced by peace. This story, and others like it, reveal a core tenet of Jesus' ministry. He saw sickness and suffering not as God's desired will, as the work of the enemy, the result of a fallen world under the sway of destructive spiritual powers. His healings were acts of liberation. He was, in the words of the prophet Isaiah, setting the captives free. He was demonstrating his authority not just over bacteria and viruses, but over the spiritual forces of chaos and death. He was reclaiming enemy-held territory, one tormented soul at a time, establishing a beachhead for the kingdom of God, a kingdom of peace, sanity, and wholeness. Beyond these dramatic encounters with leprosy and demons, Jesus' ministry was a continuous stream of restoring wholeness to people suffering from all kinds of physical ailments. He healed blindness, deafness, paralysis, fever, and chronic conditions that had baffled the ancient world. Each of these healings was more than just a medical marvel. It was a performed parable, a sign pointing to a deeper truth about who he was and what he had come to do. One of the most profound of these stories is the healing of the paralytic in Capernaum. A large crowd has packed the house where Jesus is teaching. So 4 men, in an act of remarkable faith and friendship, climb onto the roof, dig a hole through the mud and thatch, and lower their paralyzed friend on a mat right in front of Jesus. Seeing their faith, Jesus says something completely unexpected to the paralyzed man. "Son, your sins are forgiven." The religious leaders in the room are scandalized. He is blaspheming. They think to themselves, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus, knowing their thoughts, confronts them directly. Which is easier, he asks, to say to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Rise, take up your bed and walk"? The answer is obvious. Anyone can say your sins are forgiven because it's an invisible, unverifiable claim. But to command a paralyzed man to walk is to make a claim that will be instantly proven true or false. And so Jesus connects the two. "But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He then turns to the paralytic. "I say to you, rise, pick up your bed, and go home." And the man does. He gets up, picks up his mat, and walks out in front of everyone. This miracle is a direct statement about the connection between physical and spiritual brokenness. Jesus demonstrates that he has come to heal both. The physical healing, the visible miracle, serves as the undeniable proof of his authority to perform the spiritual healing, the invisible act of forgiving sin. He is showing that the brokenness of the world, which manifests as both paralysis and sin, is what he has come to mend. His mission is one of total restoration. This theme of restoration is equally powerful in the story of the woman with the issue of blood. She had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. Not only would this have left her chronically weak and anemic, but under Jewish purity laws, her condition made her permanently, ritually unclean. Like a leper, anyone or anything she touched would become unclean. She was in a state of constant social and religious isolation, having spent all her money on doctors who only made her worse. She comes to Jesus in desperation, thinking, "If I can just touch his clothes, I will be made well." She presses through the crowd, reaches out, and touches the fringe of his garment. Instantly, the bleeding stops. At the same moment, Jesus feels power go out from him. He stops and asks, "Who touched me?" The disciples are incredulous. The crowd is pressing in on all sides. But Jesus insists. The woman, terrified, comes forward, falls at his feet, and tells him the whole story. Jesus' response is filled with tenderness. He doesn't rebuke her for making him unclean. Instead, he affirms her. He calls her daughter, restoring her to a place of family and dignity. He says, "Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." He lifts her out of her 12-year shame and gives her back her health, her purity, and her place in the community. Jesus also directly confronts the deeply ingrained theology that sickness was a direct punishment for a specific sin. In the 9th chapter of John's Gospel, he and his disciples encounter a man who was born blind. The disciples, reflecting the common wisdom of the day, ask a clinical theological question. "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" They see the man not as a person, but as a theological problem to be solved. Jesus' answer demolishes their entire framework. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, Jesus replies, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. Reframes the man's entire life of suffering. It is not a punishment to be endured, but an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed. He then performs a very earthy physical healing. He spits on the ground, makes mud, and anoints the man's eyes, telling him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. The man obeys, and for the first time in his life, he can see. The rest of the long chapter details the man's interrogation by the Pharisees, who, in their spiritual blindness, refuse to accept the miracle. But the healed man, whose physical eyes have been opened, also has his spiritual eyes opened, and he comes to recognize Jesus as the Son of Man and worships him. The story brilliantly contrasts the growing sight of the healed man with the deepening blindness of the religious leaders, showing that Jesus' mission was to bring light into both physical and spiritual darkness. Finally, Jesus' healing ministry reaches its ultimate climax in his confrontation with the final enemy, the last and greatest plague upon humanity, death itself. If disease is the corruption of life, death is its cessation. And in the 11th chapter of John, Jesus demonstrates that his authority extends even over the grave. His friend Lazarus is sick. The man's sisters, Mary and Martha, send a message to Jesus. But Jesus, in a move that seems strangely unfeeling, deliberately delays his journey. He waits until he knows Lazarus is already dead. When he finally arrives in Bethany, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha, in her grief, runs out to meet him, expressing a faith mixed with regret. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus responds with one of the most powerful statements in all of Scripture. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." As Jesus approaches the tomb and sees the grief of Mary and the others, he is deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. The text gives us the shortest, and perhaps most poignant verse in the entire Bible. Jesus wept, the Son of God, who holds the power of life and death, weeps in the face of the pain and separation that death causes. He mourns with his friends. Then, standing before the cave tomb, he commands the stone to be rolled away. Martha objects with grim practicality. "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." She is underscoring the finality of death. But Jesus insists. He prays aloud to his Father, and then cries out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And from the darkness of the tomb, the man who was dead emerges, still bound in his grave clothes. It is the ultimate sign. Jesus does not just heal the symptoms of a fallen world. He has power over its final consequence. His raising of Lazarus is the ultimate demonstration that the kingdom he has come to bring is a kingdom of life, a new creation that will ultimately reverse death itself. It is the final, irrefutable proof that he is who he claims to be. Our journey through the mysterious plagues and diseases of the biblical world has taken us from the blood-red Nile to a borrowed tomb in Bethany. We began with plagues that were signs of God's judgment and righteous anger, events that created separation and demonstrated his awesome power. We end with a ministry that is defined by healing, a ministry where God, in the person of Jesus Christ, steps into human suffering, touches the untouchable, and brings restoration. The healings of Jesus were not just random acts of compassion. They were strategic strikes against the kingdom of darkness. They were tangible, visible previews of the coming kingdom of God, a new reality where, as the book of Revelation promises, he will one day wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. The ultimate irony and the final, beautiful truth of the story is that Jesus himself would ultimately heal the plague of sin and death, not by calling down power from heaven, but by taking the full force of that plague upon himself. On the cross, he became, in a sense, the ultimate unclean one, the scapegoat who bore the sins of the world, suffering the ultimate separation from God. His death was not a defeat, but the very mechanism by which the final healing of the world would be accomplished. His resurrection 3 days later was the ultimate proof that the plague of death had been defeated, and that the new creation, a world without sickness or sorrow, had truly begun.